Hello and welcome. I'm Millicent Walker. Here are the stories making our headlines this hour. Russian missiles hit targets in Donetsk and Kramatorsk, killing at least one person, injuring 4 others. Sweltering temperatures in Europe as countries hit record temperatures while wildfires rage on. And Sri Lankan lawmakers nominate candidates for tomorrow's presidential election. Welcome once more. Let's bring you up to speed on developments from and regarding the Russian invasion of Ukraine. First off, Russian President Vladimir Putin has arrived in Tehran for scheduled talks with President Ibrahim Raisi and Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan. The official purpose of the visit is to discuss the situation in Syria, though the talks are also expected to address the impact of the war in Ukraine, particularly its effect on grain exports. We'll have more on this in just a few minutes. And speaking of grains, the Kremlin says Russia expects talks on the safe passage for Ukrainian grain shipments via the Black Sea to continue in the near future. Government spokesperson Dmitry Peskov says Russia is willing to do its best to ensure that Ukrainian grain can reach global markets. Turkey said on Monday that officials from Russia, Ukraine, Turkey and the United Nations are expected to meet later this week to discuss the issue, which the UN says is contributing to a global food crisis. The European Commission has proposed spending $512 million to finance joint defence purchases among member states to replenish weapons stocks following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. European Commissioner Terry Breton says EU countries have drawn on their stocks of ammunition, light and heavy artillery, anti-aircraft and anti-tank defence systems, and even armoured vehicles and tanks. And the mayor of Ukraine's Donbass region of Donetsk says a Russian missile has hit the center of the city of Kramatorsk. Now, he revealed this on Facebook, saying there were casualties without any more details. Let's take out from today's attacks. We are aware of so far that firefighters in Odessa have been battling to contain a number of fires in the aftermath of a Russian missile strike on the city, in which at least 4 people were injured. Ukrainian authorities say Russian forces have intensified long-distance strikes on targets far from the front, killing large numbers of civilians. Moscow insists it is hitting only military targets. President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russian forces have fired more than 3,000 cruise missiles and uncountable artillery shells during the 5-month conflict. Just yesterday, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu ordered generals to prioritize destroying Ukraine's long-range missile and artillery weapons after strikes on Russian supply lines. And even today, when Sergei Shoigu announced that Russian forces have destroyed ammunition depots in the southern Odessa region that were storing weapons supplied to Kyiv by the United States and the European countries, he, however, did not say how many depots it had destroyed or what weapons were being stored there. Well, Ukraine continues to train new civilian volunteers to help fight against Russian forces, as the country claims to have a total of 1 million in its armed forces and aims to recapture the Russian-controlled south regions. A group of civilian volunteers have recently joined Ukraine's territorial defense, which is operating together with the army against Russia. During a regular training day in a forest near Bucha, these volunteer fighters were going through the ambush training. Surprising the Russians from behind in order to neutralize their commanders has proven effective so far. The training required for this, however, had to be drastically cut short. Colonel of Ukraine's territorial defense, Andriy Syuba, says normal education takes about 2 to 3 months, but he says we don't have much time. That's why we had to reduce it so that the group will be ready in just about 4 weeks. But a significant part of this alleged million is already involved in defending the remaining Donbass territory and could not be used in any counter-offensive. Nevertheless, the country's military is optimistic. And to Ukrainian parliament, which has voted to dismiss the country's SBU chief, that's Ukraine Security Agency, and the country's prosecutor general 2 days after they were fired by President Volodymyr Zelensky, saying they had failed to root out employees collaborating with Russia. Hours after announcing their dismissals, President Zelensky said investigations have begun on personnel in the SBU. The careers of SBU Security Service Chief Ivan Bakanov and Prosecutor General Irina Venediktova had personified Zelensky's policy of putting young loyalists in charge of fighting corruption since the former TV comic came to power in 2019. But nearly 5 months after Russia's invasion, the president acknowledged that his two allies had failed to root out traitors and collaborators in the organizations. In his regular nightly address, he mentioned that a personnel audit of the security service was taking place and the issue of the dismissal of 28 officials was being considered.
Питання щодо звільнення 28 посадовців.
One more important piece of news regarding the security service of Ukraine. A personnel audit of the security service is taking place. The issue of the dismissal of 28 officials is being considered from different levels in different directions, but the grounds are similar: unsatisfactory job performance. The armed forces of our state have managed to inflict significant logistical losses on the occupiers. It is getting increasingly harder for the Russian army to hold its positions in the occupied territory. Step by step, we advance, breaking the occupiers' supply lines, detecting and neutralizing collaborators. The perspective is evident. The Ukrainian flag will be in all our cities and villages. It is only a question of time.
Well, we had mentioned this earlier. President Vladimir Putin in Iran for talks with President Ibrahim Raisi and Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey. Iranian political analyst Mohammed Malandi says Iran and Russia will seek to reach consensus with Turkey on regional situation, including issues surrounding Syria, and strengthen economic and trade cooperation at an upcoming meeting among the three countries. At the talks, Iran and Russia are expected to discuss the issues with Turkey in the hope that the Turkish side will reconsider its stance on Syria. Malandi said that in the context of the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, coupled with the increasing sanctions on Russia from the US, both Russia, which is being sanctioned, and Turkey, which is facing economic difficulties, are more willing to strengthen cooperation with Iran. Therefore, he says that seeking wider economic and trade cooperation will be another important topic high on the agenda of the meeting. The trilateral summit is coming after US President Joe Biden on Saturday wrapped up his first trip to the Middle East since taking office, with a lukewarm response from regional countries.
Iran and Russia both oppose the Turkish policy in Syria, and they believe it creates a threat to regional stability and global stabilities. So the Russians and the Iranians want to convince the Turks that they have to rethink their foreign policy. And there are ways that they are thinking about engaging with Turks in order to help bring about that change. Russians want to quickly complete the north-south corridor so that the Russians can trade from Iran into the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. That would be a great benefit to the Russians, and they can export their grain and other goods through Iran. The countries in the region recognize that the United States is not the power that it was before. It's more, I don't want to say it's an empty shell, but it's definitely not what it was a decade or 2 decades or especially 3 decades ago. So for the Iranians, this trip was a major failure.
Meanwhile, Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi has stressed the importance of maintaining Syria's territorial integrity. He was speaking at a joint news conference with Turkish President. Both leaders held talks in the Iranian capital ahead of the trilateral summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Turkey, which has mounted 4 operations in northern Syria since 2016, has vowed to launch more military operations to extend 30-kilometer deep safe zones along the border. Any Turkish operation in Syria would attack the Kurdish YPG militia, a key part of the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, that controls large parts of North Syria and is regarded by Washington as an important ally against Islamic State. Ukraine's First Lady Olena Zelenska has met with Administrator of the United States Agency for International Development, Samantha Power, in the United States. It's been a while the First Lady has been seen in public. She was accompanied by Ukrainian Ambassador to the U.S., Oksana Makarova. Ms. Power affirmed the U.S.'s unwavering support for a sovereign, democratic and prosperous Ukraine, free and secure in its internationally recognized borders. During their meeting, Ms. Powers emphasized that the U.S. remains committed to Ukraine's long-term recovery and development, while also working to meet the urgent humanitarian needs of the Ukrainian people. Both women discussed the immediate escalating healthcare needs in Ukraine, a tragic result of Russia's invasion. They both agreed that Ukraine and its international partners must continue to balance responding to urgent priorities with planning for the country's future recovery. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says Washington will discuss with South Korea measures to limit revenues flowing to Russia, such as price cap on its oil, while the allies work to curb North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. In a speech prepared for a meeting with the South Korean counterpart, Chu Kyun-ho, Yellen said the two would explore a price cap to reduce oil earnings and other ways of holding Russia accountable for its war against Ukraine. Earlier in the day, Yellen also held separate meetings with South Korean President, during which she said the U.S. will impose harsh consequences on countries that break the international economic order.
The United States and Republic of Korea continue to work in lockstep to limit North Korea's continued development and proliferation of its nuclear and missile programs. Russia's illegal war and the global energy shock that has followed underscores the need to protect ourselves from dependence on foreign oil that makes us vulnerable to the whims of authoritarians like Vladimir Putin.
Joining me for more on the war in Ukraine is Michelle Agatishe, a legal practitioner and foreign affairs analyst. Michelle, thank you so much for joining me on the program. I'd like to begin. Russian President Vladimir Putin is in Iran for only his second foreign trip since he launched the invasion of Ukraine in February. How important do you think is this contact with Iran at this time?
Well, thank you very much, Millicent, for having me. I think that it's quite important because this is a time where the international community has tried to more or less utilize, basically making Russia a pariah nation as one of the ways to win the war in Ukraine. Now, seeing that Russia is still on the table, and not only on the table, a significant power broker in that region, of course, will send alarm bells ringing, particularly in Washington. But just to say, though, that in terms of the impact for this war, I do not see that to be so significant, and the reason is simple. Prior to the Ukraine war was the issue in Syria, and the primary focus of this trilateral meeting between Iran, Turkey, and Russia is Syria on the agenda, issues relating to how Turkey is going to deal with potentially expanding the safety zone. As you would recall, Turkey backs the rebels, whereas Iran backs the Syrian government. So those are the critical issues. So despite the fact that the Ukraine matter will come up, the impact it would have, I don't see to be so significant, because despite the fact of the Ukraine war, Russia still remains a critical player in resolving the conflict in Syria, which has also dragged on for almost a decade now.
Many have wondered what, they might conclude, and this is saying the re-emergence of these three countries, Russia, Turkey, Iran, many wonder what could be the alliance, especially now, considering the positions that, these countries are taking, and this is concerning the war in Ukraine. U.S. officials accusing Tehran planning to supply Russia with drones, and then we have the role Turkey is playing with supplying Ukraine, of course, drones, combat drones to the Ukrainian military.
Yes, I mean, it's a very interesting time in world geopolitics, if I could say so. And why that's also very interesting is the fact that prior to the arrival of Putin yesterday, Recep Erdogan and the leader of Iran entered into a 20-year bilateral agreement wherein they agreed to even upscale bilateral trade between their two countries to, I believe, about $35 billion. Now, that is inherently problematic for the other side of the international divide. Why? Because Iran, as we would all recall, prior to the Ukraine war, was the pariah nation. And Turkey, on the other hand, is a member of NATO. And in fact, recently, despite the fact that Recep Erdogan had acceded to, Finland and Finland joining NATO, further even stated a couple of days ago that, look, they can still decide not to accede to that in Parliament. So I don't see the end goal here, but I definitely see that this is something that is going to signal alarm bells and also feeds into that conversation about a new world order, particularly when you look at the increasing cooperation, for example, between Russia and China. So if you bring Iran into the mix, Iran, who is also a major supplier of oil and gas, and we understand what's going on in the oil and gas space, particularly as it relates to increased, prices of everything really in Europe, right, in terms of food security. So it's almost like that kind of conversation or that kind of statement from Russia saying that, well, you can't get me out of the game. You can't take my significance away. And, your trade bites aren't hurting me. Try harder.
Exactly. Extremely keen to show that the international sanctions have failed to isolate it. But are friends sticking around? Does Russia have any friends at this time?
Well, I'm not sure. I wouldn't say that they have friends. I would just say that certain interests are still superseding, right, concerted international efforts to stop the Ukraine war. And that, of course, is as a result of, Russia's, behemoth role that they play, particularly in the energy space, and how important energy is to many economies. There are some significant economies that are still trading and dealing with Russia almost as normal. You have India, which is one of the biggest economies in the world at the moment. You have China, who has a bilateral relationship with Russia that was signed after the invasion of Ukraine, and a relationship that we basically stated in the text of those documents that it is a friendship with no limits. You have Iran, who is still looking to Russia as a broker in terms of dealing with Turkey. And of course, you also have Turkey, which to some are saying that, well, even though they seem on the face of it to be supporting Ukraine, for many, they have also questioned how far they really are going. So I think it's a situation of almost power blocks, if you may. What I fear is us going back to what we had pre-1990s, before, Gorbachev and everything, where you had, a clear distinction in the world, during the Cold War, where you had those who followed the path of Russia and those who had the path of USA. Why? What could then potentially happen is a situation where you have micro wars in different smaller states. And as we all know from the African saying, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers.
Somewhat, some BFF still exists in geopolitics. In terms of this meeting, they're also going to be looking at grain exports from Ukraine. There are allegations that, Russia is shelling that and preventing that passage. Do you think that Turkey can broker a tentative agreement between Russia and Ukraine leaders?
Well, I would hope that they will be able to broker some. I understand that even aside from Turkey, even those in some of the Western countries are also trying to broker some form of agreement. And I think this is something that is particularly important even for us that live in Africa, for example. A lot of the grain that comes into Africa comes from Ukraine. They're one of the largest producers of wheat, etc. Now, to the extent that the port of Odessa remains blockaded, we might have a real situation of excessive famine, right? And we will then be a byproduct of the war, even though we have, for most of it, been an innocent bystander. So even though I cannot say whether, in fact, the Turks will be able to broker some sort of palliative deal, if I may use that word, I would hope for it, for the best interest of even us who are right across each other on the screen.
Indeed, and the larger population. We appreciate your time. Thank you. It was a pleasure having you join us. Mitchell Agatishe is a legal practitioner and foreign affairs analyst. Thank you again.
Millicent, it's always my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Coming up on The World Today. The World Health Organization is warning that Europe must accelerate vaccine uptake and bring back mask wearing to tackle surge of COVID-19 cases. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Temperatures are still rising across Western Europe as a ferocious heat wave heads north. Heat warnings have been issued in France and in the UK, while temperatures in Spain are already in the 40s. Thousands of people have also been evacuated in France, Portugal, Spain, and in Greece as authorities battle deadly wildfires. The UK is expected to see its hottest day ever, and experts say France faces a heat apocalypse. Dozens of fires have erupted across the country, scorching acres of land and forcing authorities to evacuate people from their homes. One passenger on a train traveling through areas affected by wildfires in Zamora described a little hellish situation when flames burned around the train and the journey came to a halt.
What I was amazed is that this was the first time that I saw how quickly a fire can spread.
Almost the entire country faces an extreme fire risk, with fires burning thousands of hectares in Galicia, Castile, Leon, Catalonia, and other parts. In France, many in the capital, Paris, have been seeking shade, cold drinks, and ice cream. Some tourists decided to visit a museum in the afternoon to avoid the hottest hours of the day. As part of a heatwave program, some city halls open cool rooms to allow the elderly and frail people relax under a cool atmosphere. In other parts of Europe, the Netherlands recorded its hottest day of the year so far on Monday, with temperatures reaching 33.6 degrees Celsius. Belgium and Germany are expected to see temperatures around 40 degrees Celsius in the coming days. Temperatures in Portugal hit 47 degrees Celsius last Thursday, a record for July. Most of the country has been placed under high fire danger by the National Meteorological Office, IPMA. Let's bring in our London correspondent for more. Juliana Lanka joins us now. Hi, Juliana. It's supposed to be the hottest day in Britain today. How hot has it been?
in one word, hot, Millicent. It's been incredibly hot, as you can see. I am melting here. I believe at about 12 o'clock today, Heathrow Airport reached 40.3 degrees Celsius. This is the hottest day on record ever in the UK. And I think a couple of weeks ago, a lot of people were joking about this, particularly, of course, if you're in the global south. Everybody knows that Britons do like to talk about the weather, but no, this is indeed pretty serious now. There is a national emergency currently taking place in London, in Greater London. Lots of the pictures that you were just showing in Europe is actually taking place within London. I believe the fire brigade are tackling about 20 separate fires. These are wildfires, grass fires that have been spreading all across London and the United Kingdom. And it is really serious because if you think about it, this is a cold island. We've got average temperatures of between about 4 degrees at the lowest and previously about 14 degrees at the highest. And this is throughout the year. Everybody used to complain that you would never get more than 2 or 3 days of sun in Britain. And we've seen extreme temperatures over the past couple of days. This has led, unfortunately, to some deaths. We are seeing that houses are being destroyed as we speak. And I've got to say, as I have been saying over the past couple of days, please, 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 if you are in London, do adhere to the government advice, which is, of course, to try and keep as cool as you can by staying hydrated, but particularly the elderly within our community and newborn children. Mothers should not be covering them with socks and hats. You know, I was on Oxford Circus, just a stone's throw away from the office. You still see mothers out with their children in prams covering them up. Just don't do that today. It's just absolutely not worth it because we are seeing that tragically this extreme weather, as you said, a heat apocalypse that we're experiencing in Europe is killing people.
And, you know, we're learning the heat there's been a bit of disruption to everyday life, transportation affected, and this is also affecting schools, yes?
It is affecting schools. Several schools have been shut. If they haven't been shut, then they have asked parents to collect them much earlier because, unfortunately, Millicent, and we have been having this conversation over the past couple of years in this country, the country is just not set up for this extreme weather. Why should it be? Especially because if you think about it, in the history of this nation, we've never experienced heat like this. But I think it's fair to say, and you know, you don't have to be a climate change enthusiast to believe it, but this is the result of human-induced weather patterns. It's just not just obviously here in the global north. We're seeing it have devastating consequences, particularly in Nigeria and then other places in the Horn of Africa. And there have been several COBRA meetings over the past couple of days, led by our still Prime Minister Boris Johnson, trying to see how we can tackle this in the future, because it got to 40.3 degrees today. And I think this is definitely something we could be seeing again, probably in August.
And Juliana, I mean, are there restrictions for those working in offices in terms of, you know, government's response, perhaps to a few hours as everyone tries to cope with the rising heat?
Well, yes and no. I think one good thing from the pandemic is, of course, so many firms up and down the country adopted this hybrid work pattern, or not even hybrid. Some people are very, very fortunate enough to be able to work from home. But of course, you can't work from home for some jobs. If you're a security guard, you can't work from home. If you work in the NHS, you can't work from home. And you can't work from home if you're a cleaner. But of course, fortunately, so many offices do have air conditioning, and I believe union bosses were asking the government to ensure that private sector spaces are not hotter or warmer than 25 degrees Celsius. But, you know, some are not. Even yesterday, where we're located, there was a power cut just because of the heat, and the machinery couldn't take it. But I've got to say, lots of employers across the country are asking people to work from home where they can. If you are falling under that category, many people within our community do, working in lower skilled jobs. And then, just take the break when you need it. Make sure you stay hydrated. Loosen up a couple of buttons on your top shirt, loosen your tie. Those are the kind of things that you have to do to ensure that you stay safe. Because, of course, even though you do ask your employer to make sure they set the rules, you have to make sure that you are taking your life and your health and well-being safety yourself.
And we're looking at a lot more air conditioning, and we're looking at more bills, electricity bills and the likes. We're also seeing temperatures rise in France, Spain, Portugal, up to 47 degrees Celsius. Many wonder how, indeed, they're also coping. And then there's also the wildfires, and many wonder how those lands will be arable afterwards.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's certainly one for a horticulturalist or an environmentalist expert. But yeah, of course, this is a huge problem, especially if you think of the UK now. Of course, like I said, there are more than a dozen fires taking place at a time where we are going through the worst cost of living crisis on record. There was some data yesterday from Springboard, which looks at footfall in the UK, and the numbers were down. People were just not willing to go shopping on the high street when it's sweltering hot. So certainly that's an issue, and I'm sure we will start seeing figures and estimates of what this has cost not only the economy in the UK but the economy across Europe. But as you were saying, the extreme temperature that we're seeing in places like southern France and in Spain and in Portugal is very worrying. It has led to thousands of people being evacuated from their homes. I believe about 24,000 people were evacuated from southern France earlier this afternoon. I believe about 1,000 people have died trying to flee these wildfires in Spain and Portugal. And so definitely, I think heads of government are going to have to start taking this more seriously. We do have COP27 taking place in Egypt very, very soon. We know that COP26 didn't go far enough, but the evidence is here. A lot of the experts say, this is something that the global south can deal with. They can deal with it in Africa. When it's knocking on their doorstep, perhaps, unfortunately, quite grim, they will start taking this seriously because it's costing their economy and it's costing lives too.
Indeed. Many thanks, Juliana, for that update, and stay cool.
Thanks, Melissa.
Well, let's stay on in Britain, where outgoing Prime Minister Boris Johnson today chaired his first cabinet meeting before standing down. Speaking of which, in the third round of voting in the race to premiership, and leader of the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch, has been eliminated from the election as she scored only 59 votes, leaving Penny Mordaunt, who scored 92 votes, Rishi Sunak, who scored 118 votes, and Liz Truss with 86 votes.
Badenoch, 59 votes. Mordaunt, 92 votes. Sunak, 118 votes. Truss, 86 votes. There was one spoiled ballot paper. We had a full term, we had one vote not cast. So Kemi Badenoch is eliminated from the election. The remaining three candidates will proceed to a final ballot of the Parliamentary Party tomorrow. This will take place, I mean it this time, will take place between 1 and 3, with the result declared at 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Thank you.
Back to Boris Johnson now. He says the country must balance the risk faced by the ongoing heatwave with the economic impact of slowing down, and called on schools to stay open.
I think it's very, very important that we think back to that moment when we opened up and try and balance risk with the need to keep our country, our society and our economy moving. And I hope, Cabinet, that you are all agreed that as far as possible, we should keep schools open.
Yes. Yes.
And we should keep our transport system going as far as we possibly can, and we should keep our fantastic NHS providing for the people of this country in the way that they need and expect. With temperatures setting records in this country, who can doubt that we were right to be the first major economy to go for net zero? And I know it's, it may be sometimes unfashionable to say this now, but it is the right thing to do. If we're going to protect our planet and if we're going to do the right thing to tackle global warming, it's essential that we set that lead.
The German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock says a climate dialogue held in the capital Berlin was meant to help countries achieve their important climate goals. The world is not on the way to achieving 1.5 degrees in global warming. She was making the comment today after she and her Egyptian counterpart, Sameh Shouki, hosted the so-called Pittsburgh Climate Dialogue, which focused on how to increase urgently needed national climate ambitions. Health matters now. The World Health Organization is warning European nations to accelerate vaccine uptake and bring back mask wearing to tackle a surge in COVID-19 cases driven by an Omicron offshoot. To avoid stricter measures later in the year, WHO Regional Director for Europe, Hans Kluge, is calling on countries to take action now to avoid overwhelming health systems in the autumn and winter as the Omicron subvariant BA.5 continues to spread rapidly. Close to 3 million new COVID-19 cases were reported in Europe last week, which accounted for nearly half of all new cases globally. Hospitalizations have doubled over the same period, and close to 3,000 people die of the disease every week, Kluge said in an accompanying statement, pointing to a rise in cases in society, which is behaving as it did before the pandemic. He stressed the need for pandemic stabilizers, such as a second booster dose ahead of the expected variant-specific vaccines in autumn, as well as the promotion of mask wearing and better ventilation.
Well, what we have seen is that there has been a tripling of the number of new COVID-19 cases over the last 6 weeks. That's something that we have to follow very closely. Also, a slight increase in hospitalization. The virus has never gone away. People sometimes ask, is the virus back? It has never gone away. It's still there. It's spreading. It is mutating. And unfortunately, it's still taking a lot of lives. Last week alone, in our region, 3,000 people sadly passed away, and about 3 million new cases were reported. If you haven't got any shot this year, you are no longer protected, particularly with the BA.5 sublineage of the Omicron variant, which has some escape to the immunity. Time is running out. Many people, including myself, got the booster more than 6 months ago. Immunity is waning. We have a BA.5 sublineage, which has a huge advantage in terms of transmission.
Over in India, only drone footage can show the extent of the damage to crops and homes in the western Gujarat state, where at least 7,000 hectares of land was flooded today, severely damaging crops. Rescue workers have been using rubber dinghies to reach flood victims in Chandrapur and take in essential supplies. Incessant rain in Navsari district caused the Purna, Kaveri and Ambika rivers to overflow, which led to loss of lives, properties, livelihoods, as well as the destruction of crops. Meanwhile, a number of houses in western Maharashtra state were partially submerged, leaving locals to swim their way through the muddy flood waters. Record-breaking rain in some regions with the onset of the annual monsoon in the country has highlighted the challenges the country faces as it tries to adapt to climate change. Extreme weather in South Asia has become more frequent in recent years, and environmentalists warn that climate change could lead to even more serious disasters. Lawmakers in Sri Lanka today put forth the nominations of 3 candidates due to run in tomorrow's presidential election. Acting President and Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, former Cabinet Minister Julius Hapanum, and the leader of the National People's Party, Natha Vimukti Paramuna Party, and Nura Kamura Sanyange were the 3 candidates nominated during the brief parliamentary session. Haparuma is a former journalist and ruling party lawmaker who has long operated in the shadows of the powerful Rajapaksa family that dominated the country's politics for decades. Opposition leader Sajith Premadasa, who was originally expected to run, said he withdrew from the presidential race in order to support rival candidate Haparuma. Meanwhile, students, trade unions and other groups today marched through downtown Colombo against Ranil Wickremesinghe's expected bid for president. Crowds outside the main railway station in the capital chanted slogans and demanded Wickremesinghe step down. A procession made its way to the building of the presidential secretariat, where they burned an effigy of the acting president. And still ahead on the program. More Chinese women taking to surf skateboarding to pass time amid a COVID shutdown in the country. Please stay with us. More politics, this time in Thailand, as Prime Minister Prayuth Chan-o-cha fended off accusations of corruption and economic mismanagement in a televised session of Parliament today as a censure debate got underway, seeking to dent his credibility with an election due within 11 months. The 68-year-old Prayuth, a retired army chief who first came to power in a coup 8 years ago, has prevailed in 3 no-confidence motions since a 2019 election saw him stay on as Prime Minister in what is now a crowded 17-party coalition. Prayuth also faces challenges from 16 renegade lawmakers who earlier this year were expelled from his Palang Pracharat party and have vowed to vote with the opposition. 10 cabinet ministers are also subject to the censure, which runs until Friday, with a no-confidence vote scheduled for Saturday, July the 23rd. And in bilateral relations, East Timor President Jose Ramos Horta is on a visit to Indonesia, where he hopes to boost trade ties between the countries and seal a decade-long bid by his nation to join the Association of Southeast Asian Nations next year. Ramos Horta met his counterpart Joko Widodo on his first state visit to neighbouring Indonesia since he was elected in April for a second stint as president. He previously served as president of East Timor, which is also known as Timor-Leste, between 2007 and 2012.
I'm very grateful that Indonesia remains very committed to Timor-Leste membership in ASEAN. As very normal, Timor-Leste is part of Southeast Asia. We have fulfilled many of the requirements necessary for a functioning economy, a functioning democracy. So Timor-Leste will be a productive member of ASEAN. So we hope to join ASEAN during Indonesian presidency.
Meanwhile, South Korea's Foreign Minister Park Jin has met with his Japanese counterparts Fumio Kishida in Tokyo to offer condolences for the death of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He told reporters later, quote, "I have received the message of condolence from South Korea's Foreign Minister Park Jin on behalf of President Yoon regarding the death of former Prime Minister Abe, and I express my gratitude to him." Park arrived in Tokyo just yesterday for a 2-day trip that aimed to overcome historical disputes and repair strained ties between the two countries. Relations have been fraught for years over the bitter legacy of Japan's occupation of Korea from 1910 to 1945. Disputes concern issues from wartime forced labor to export controls, and both nations have expressed interest in improving relations. Into the United States, where Monday was a day for residents of the Texas town of Uvalde, where a gunman shot and killed 21 people, including children, at the Robb Elementary School, to question authorities, mainly members of a school board, after a leaked surveillance video showed a delayed police response during the mass shooting. Parents, grandparents, and other community members gathered at John H. Harrell Auditorium for a meeting with school board trustees to address security at Robb Elementary School ahead of the fall reopening. Attendees took turns to speak at a microphone at the front of the hall, and many demanded the removal of police officers and district leaders. Texas Department of Public Safety, DPS, confirmed that police will form an internal committee to review the response by state law enforcement to May elementary school mass shooting in Uvalde after a Texas legislature's probe blamed systemic failures and poor leadership.
Having sincere condolences and reaching out 2 months ago would have been more appropriate than what y'all are doing now. The changes that y'all are trying to make, we understand. But y'all's condolences and apologies don't mean shit to us anymore, excuse my language. Because y'all had the opportunity to treat us a little bit better, and y'all didn't. Y'all didn't realize or feel our pain. The only reason why we feel like you're coming out now is because you saw the videos. It's out there, and now we all know the truth.
Do you want to bring healing to this community, to these families? I would suggest that you, the Chief of Police, Uvalde Chief of Police, the Uvalde Sheriff's Office, and Macron, and all those other law enforcement agencies who are in that hall, all come up here and tell these people, these families, we failed you. We failed you.
What are you guys going to do to make sure I don't have to watch my friends die? What are you going to do to make sure I don't have to wait 77 minutes bleeding out on my classroom floor just like my little sister did? I know there's nothing you can do to bring my sister back, but maybe, just maybe, if you do something to change this, you can prevent the next family from losing their child.
Thank you.
Prison authorities in Ecuador say 13 prisoners have been killed at a prison in the city of Santo Domingo in the latest incident of deadly jail violence in the Andean country. The government of conservative President Guillermo Lasso attributes prison violence to fights between gangs over control of territory and drug trafficking routes. Last year, 316 prisoners died during riots in various prisons across Ecuador. The police and the armed forces were retaking control of the penitentiary. The Sinai Prisons Agency said this on Twitter. It earlier called the incident a dispute. The country's prisons house about 33,900 people and are 12.5% beyond maximum capacity, according to official figures. Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro yesterday invited members of the diplomatic corps to hear his charges that Brazil's election system was open to fraud ahead of October elections, in which he is trailing in a bid for a second term. Addressing some 40 diplomats invited to his residence in an unprecedented briefing 3 months before the country's general election, he told them it isn't a trusted system because it cannot be audited. The president gave no evidence of fraud, but said a hacker got inside the electronic voting system during the election he won in 2018, an incident that police concluded had not compromised the result in any way. Bolsonaro told the envoys the Brazilian military should be called in to help secure transparency in the October 2 election. He has pushed electoral authorities to accept a parallel vote count to be carried out by the armed forces. They have ruled that out. He has repeatedly questioned Brazil's electronic voting machines, arguing without proof that that they are susceptible to fraud, which has raised fears he might refuse to concede defeat, as former U.S. President Donald Trump did in 2020. His attempts to discredit Brazil's electoral system, which has been used since 1996 with no evidence of irregularities, has led his opponents to suspect Bolsonaro may refuse to accept a possible victory by leftist former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who is leading by double digits in opinion polls.
No passado, alguns países tentaram usar,
and more women in China are honing their skills in skateboarding as they look for ways to keep active during a COVID pandemic shutdown. One of them is surf skater and community event organizer Duolan, who moves fast and light on a surf skateboard, gliding down an empty road most afternoons. The professional dancer runs a free weekly surf skating class for women on a car-free section of road close to the National Aquatic Center on Saturday afternoons. Surf skating, a novice-friendly version of skateboarding that uses a more flexible front-end wheel assembly known as a truck to enable deeply carved turns akin to surfing, has taken off in Chinese cities since the spring, especially among women. Many took up the sport as a hobby when COVID curbs made summer travel difficult. Considered easier to learn, less prone to wipeouts than other forms of skateboarding, surf skating also got a boost from the buzz over snow sports in China this year as Beijing hosted the 2022 Winter Olympics. And as clubs and networks and group classes have proliferated, the size of Duolan's class has gone from around a dozen regular attendees late April to nearly 1,500. So while most other major countries have chosen to live with the virus, China is adhering to a dynamic zero-COVID policy that aims to eradicate outbreaks early, which means more time for more people to learn how to surf skate, thereby keeping mind and body active while also staying safe during the pandemic. And that's our program at this time. Thank you for watching. I'm Millicent Walker. We have more later, of course, on our website. You can watch more of this episode on our YouTube channel. Thanks for watching again.